Hi guys. Hello. Welcome to your first day of e-learning. And we are going to, on our first day, we're going to do something kind of exciting. We're going to go through the graphs of sine and cosine. And that's it. That's all we're going to do in this video is graph those two. They're very important. I have my first attempt with explain everything. That's how I'm making this video, so we'll just see how it goes. Okay, the rest of this, the changing amplitude, the period, and the PS stands for phase shift, we're going to do that in another video. That's all of the transformations for the graph. Okay, so let's dive right in. First thing that we are going to graph is sine of x. So step one, we're going to graph the axis values. We're going to grab the pen and graph the axis values on our unit circle. So remember, unit circle hypotenuse is 1, which means that this point is 1, 0, and this point is 0, 1. Negative 1, 0 at pi, the bottom of the circle. 3 pi over 2, we're at 0, negative 1, and 1, 0. Okay, and remember in our previous work that our x value when the hypotenuse is equal to 1 is cosine theta, and the y value turns out to be sine theta. Eraser. There we go. Okay, so we are going to use those values to graph our function. So first, we're going to look at since we're graphing sine x, we're looking at our y values. So our y values are going to be the 0, the 1, the 0, and the negative 1. Okay, so let's do this. Okay, so at 0, our y value is at 0. So let's graph 0, 0. At pi over 2, our y value is 1. So our next point is going to be pi over 2, 1. At pi, our y value is 0. So we're going to graph pi 0 back at the x-axis. At the bottom of the circle, we are at negative 1 for our y value. So negative 1 at 3 pi over 2. And once we do a full rotation around, once we hit 2 pi, our y value is 0. Okay, we are going to connect those points with a nice smooth curve. Don't connect them with straight lines. I'm going to put arrows on the end that shows that this graph is continuous. So a few things that are happening. Every time we go around the circle, we'll get those values. So if we start at 0 and go pi over 2, every rotation is going to produce those same values, which means that this graph has a period of 2 pi. So every full rotation around the circle, you'd get those same values. So you'll see that wave happening every 2 pi on the graph. Okay, we also know the domain is all real numbers. Goes on to the left and to the right forever. The range, it bounces between negative 1 to 1. And we knew that from our previous work. When we would try to do inverse sine of anything bigger than 1, it didn't work because the graph doesn't exist outside of the range of negative 1 to 1. I know that this function is an odd function, and we knew that we proved it algebraically in our last chapter. Graphically, it's odd because it is symmetric about the origin. If we were to graph this for more than one period, so let's pretend we are graphing for a few periods. Symmetric about the origin means that this point here, which both the x and y values are positive, can also be found down here where both the x and y values are negative. Symmetric about the origin. Okay, so let's go ahead and in the next graph, which I'm going to extend this just a little bit, I'd like you to take a second and pause this video and try to graph it on your own. If you need some tips as to how to start, keep on watching, and we'll just compare at the end. Okay, so the very first step to graphing, if you haven't stopped the video, is to do your x and your y axis. Now, unless there's a transformation, I always do the same for x value points, which would be your axis values. Your pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And then I'd mark 1 and negative 1. Now that's going to change once we have vertical stretches and shrinks, but for now we're going to do 1 to -1. And then you're going to do your axis values. Try to do them in your head. So we are graphing sine, which means my y values at 0 is 0. My y value at pi over 2 is 1. My y value at pi is 0 again. At the bottom of the circle, the y value is -1, and the y value is 0 at 2 pi. And then you're going to connect those points with straight lines and arrows on the ends, and you've completed your y equals sine x graph. Okay, moving on. Let's take a look at cosine. So since we're graphing it for the first time, I'm going to put my axis values on my circle one more time. Can hear my rugrats upstairs. -1, 0, and 0, -1. Okay, and of course we're doing cosine. Cosine is going to be my x values. So the 1, the 0, the -1, and the 0. Okay, so let's try it again. We are looking at x values at 0. So my first value at 0 is going to be 1. So I'm going to graph my first point at 1. And then my next point is that x value is at 0. So I'm going to graph 0 pi over 2. At pi, my point is at -1. At 3 pi over 2, my x value is at 0. And at 2 pi, my x value is at 1. Now be very careful. You might be tempted to draw a V. It's not a V. Draw a nice curve through those 5 points. And I like to do little arrows pointing down to show that that graph is going to continue in both directions. Okay, so again, let's write down what we know. We know once again that the period on cosine is also 2 pi. It's continuous. It goes to the left and to the right forever, which means that the domain is all reals. The range is the same, -1 to 1. This function happens to be even. Again, we've done this algebraically. Graphically, that means it is symmetric over the y-axis. If I were to graph a bunch of cosines, a bunch of periods of cosines, you could see that if I were to fold the graph, the right graph onto the left graph, it would reflect over the y-axis. Okay, so once again, I'm going to have you pause your video, see if you can graph cosine on your own. Once you've graphed sine, I think you can graph cosine. You just have to remember your axis values. So go ahead and pause it and try to graph cosine. And then when you unpause it, you'll see that we have the same thing. Okay, here is our graph of y equals, I should title this, cosine x. So this should be your final result for cosine x. Your x values and y values are correctly put on the graph, and you've got a nice curve. Cosine starts at 0, 1, has a period of 2 pi. Okay, I have one more opportunity for you on this pink slide to practice graphing sine and cosine, paying attention to your x and your y axis values, and to graph the curve with arrows on the ends. Go ahead and give yourself a second, and then unpause the video to check your work. Okay, these are our final graphs for sine and cosine. In our next video, we're going to learn some fancy words for transformations that we should kind of already know how to do. So I will see you in the second video.